When you think about it, a relatively small number of arcs and islands in One Piece actually bring to mind the theme of pirates that you might expect from the world's biggest bit of pirate media. More often than not, it's superseded by the theme of adventure as well as Oda's creativity and sense of humor. But Jaya is one of those places that really embodies the pirate motif and the lawlessness that comes with it. Most of us, I assume, appreciate the variety of locations we get to in this story, but to me there's something uniquely exciting about it every time we really crank up the pirate valve. Maybe it's just nostalgia because it happens more often early on, but it feels like you can see the roots of the One Piece epic when we're in these more classically pirate-like locations. I say this because this is my bias going into talking about Jaya. I just like it aesthetically. So perhaps this is an overinterpretation, but what I think when I see elements of One Piece that bring us back to pirates in look or theme, I feel that we're dealing with the fundamentals of the story in some sense. I feel like I see something that echoes or directly references the influences that led to this story's inception. And I think that's evident over the course of Jaya. Many of the characters and themes that come up here will remain relevant until the end of the story. The arc starts immediately after Robin's interview on the image of a galleon falling from the sky and the quote, "Anything man can imagine is a possibility in reality," which feels like a variation of the Picasso quote, "Everything you can imagine is real." And those two quotes are even closer in meaning than they sound, because the Picasso quote was said in real life, and it means, or can be interpreted to mean, that everything you can imagine can be expressed through art. Thus it impacts the world, thus it's real. But within the sub-reality of in-universe One Piece, which is already a piece of artwork, whatever can be imagined is not only real through art, it's literally real in the world of One Piece, because if Oda can imagine it, he can put it in the story. This image of the galleon is so striking that it feels like Skypiea developed out of it. Like this scene was imagined first, and then Skypiea developed to make it a possibility, as an excuse to draw this huge ship falling from the sky. These next panels then introduce us to the concept of the Sky Island, continuing a trend from Alabasta by first naming the island which will be the central location for the saga, then introducing the smaller islands that we have to pass through on the way. I'm gonna skip around in the chronology a bit. We'll cover the monkeys and the chestnut, who is also a man, at the end, because the meat of this arc really hangs off the bones of the sweetest boys in town, Bellamy and Blackbeard. We meet Bellamy first, who's the highest bounty pirate around, a fact he enjoys to the fullest as he kills other pirates for being better than him at poker. But that's not quite scummy enough, because rather than just owning the fact that he's killing people who beat him, Bellamy has to get his first mate, this dickhead in ski goggles, to pretend that his opponent cheated in the game so that he's justified in killing him, despite the fact that no one believes them anyway. If you're not sure who the villain of this arc yet, he's also drawn with his face hidden in the shadows, laughing and licking his lips. I think it's probably that guy. The build-up for Bellamy feels like it would any of the other small arc villains we've come across until now. The biggest pirate in the area terrorizes local town. Makes sense. But Oda seeds the suspicion that he's comparatively weak early. Of course, his bounty is barely over half of Luffy's, but then Luffy's sort of locked out in Alabasta, so maybe it doesn't translate exactly how we think it would. More subtly, we also get the line, Bellamy the hyena definitely possesses some kind of devil fruit, which again is drawn like it's a big deal, but at this stage it really isn't. That was impressive when it was buggy in Volume 2, but we're sort of over being intimidated by the mere concept of a devil fruit at this stage. The interesting thing about Bellamy is his conversation with Luffy, Zoro, and Nami. He finds Luffy's old wanted poster, thinks he's worth 30 million, and goes to find him, presumably to collect his bounty. Meanwhile, Luffy, Nami, and Zoro are looking for information about Sky Island, and Nami made the boys promise not to fight anybody. Bellamy finds him, buys Luffy a drink, then smashes his head through a table. Now, a lot of people I've noticed make the point that Luffy doesn't beat up Bellamy at this point, because Shanks taught him not to fight people over spilled alcohol in Chapter 1. But I don't think that's exactly what happens. Firstly, he doesn't spill any alcohol, because Luffy drinks it before Bellamy grabs him, and then he also knocks Luffy's head through a table, which I'd argue is a more serious offense than the drink spillage. And on top of that, Zoro immediately points his sword at Bellamy, ready to fight, while Luffy gets back on his feet, then threatens him. So the two of them are ready to fight at this point, only they're interrupted when Nami asks the bartender about Sky Island. Then everyone laughs, and it's revealed to the reader that it's unusual in this world to believe in the existence not only of Sky Islands, but of the One Piece as well. Of course, Luffy says he wants to find the One Piece all the time, and people laugh at the idea throughout the series. But up until this point, it seemed like the people laughed because he was an upstart nobody, not because they didn't believe the treasure existed. Buggy, at the very least, is unlikely to doubt the existence of the One Piece, and he still laughs along with everyone else. Only at this point, as Bellamy explains his view of the world and Luffy stares back blankly, does it seem like Luffy loses the will to fight him. To me, this scene is one of the biggest hooks in the series because it's one of those moments where Luffy's values shine through his usual cheerful and stupid persona, and we see that there are more layers to him than happy when things are going well, angry when someone hurts his friends, which is the prototype shonen protag personality. My interpretation of this is as follows. Luffy is playing a game in which the goal is to become the Pirate King. In order to achieve this goal, he's sailing through the Grand Line, generally leaving people alone unless they A. hurt his friends, or B. stand in the way of his path to becoming the Pirate King. Luffy fighting another pirate who picks a fight on the Grand Line is in line with rule number 2. The general rule of the series is that we know either slightly more or the same as Luffy about the world around him, so it's relatively safe to assume that he also doesn't expect this speech about the One Piece being a lie. This might well be the first person Luffy meets who expresses such a view, just as it's the first person we meet. It's not surprising then that Luffy's reaction is this blank stare. I take this to be him re-evaluating the person in front of him, who he initially sees as a rival, but who turns out to not be playing the same game at all. It's him realizing that Bellamy is small and insignificant. He's not standing in the way of Luffy's route to Raftel, because he's not on that route at all. Bellamy's on the Arlong path, except he's less smart for going to the Grand Line, where at any moment any of several pirates on that same island could stop him. I like this way of looking at it, because it adds to the occasionally overstated interpretation of Luffy as a morally ambiguous character. It seems like it's almost out of arrogance that he refuses to fight Bellamy, because it means he doesn't see him as a threat at all. Not only in terms of physical strength, but in terms of their drive and their goals. Bellamy threatens nothing that Luffy cares about, and so Luffy ignores him. Does that mean that I think there's no reference to Shanks not fighting in a bar at the beginning of the series? No, because nothing is impossible for Goda, and that's a cool callback of exactly the type he likes. So I actually think it's better than what I read in those comments on reaction videos on YouTube. I think this is the moment that Luffy realizes what Shanks was talking about in the bar in Fushio Village. This moment of silence and staring is him going, oh shit, this is what Shanks meant. It doesn't matter what this idiot does, we're in different fields and in different classes, just like Shanks is in a different class from those mountain bandits. So that's how I read that scene, but I will say it's deliberately vague and difficult to understand, and Oda lets us know by having Nami ask confused questions over the course of the scene. So by no means do I claim that this interpretation is the correct one, because it could be the clean Shanks reason, it could be that they're just deliberately doing the opposite of what Nami wants to annoy her. I don't have much to say about the fight with Bellamy. Obviously, Noland becomes a friend of the crew, so when Bellamy hurts him and steals the gold, he's hurt a friend of Luffy, breaking rule number 1. Thus, he has to get beaten up, and he becomes beaten up. Not like a villain would, but like a Helmeppo would, because he's just a dickhead, he's not a threat. Bellamy is the antagonist of the Jaya arc, but a much bigger antagonist sneaks under the radar until the very end. Blackbeard has been set up through Ace's mission, but who would have expected that he was a friendly and almost beardless cherry pie guy? Not I. I love Blackbeard's introduction because it's so unassuming. He could have just been a gag character about pies and being competitive with other pirates on Jaya, and then he could have left the story forever. But instead he shows back up after the Bellamy fight to tell us that regardless of how confused we were by that scene, that he understands it completely and that he's squarely on Luffy's side of the debate. So now the contrast Luffy had with Bellamy has this weird third dimension where Blackbeard positions himself on the side of Luffy and in opposition to Bellamy, lending him quite a positive impression in this scene. And yet Luffy looks at him like this. Now maybe Luffy's shaken up by the experience with Bellamy. He certainly continues the blank stare from the bar fight, but on the other hand, this is someone who thinks like Luffy, yet he comes to the opposite conclusions. This is someone who's playing the same game as Luffy, but with different means. It's hard to tell what Zoro and him take from this conversation, but they take something more than what's being said, because this is not their normal reaction to people saying things that align with their beliefs. Luffy isn't exactly a reserved guy, yet he doesn't say a word here, and eventually Zoro just leaves. They leave saying there's more than one guy, meaning this is a crew, meaning these are real rivals in the game, not through the size of their bounties or their dominance over a town, but through intentions and worldview. The next time we see Blackbeard, it's revealed who he is and who his crew are, something that happens at exactly the proper point in the story, I think. Blackbeard was a mysterious name we'd heard from time to time, but not in a while, and Pie Guy was a mysterious character, saying things that made him sound relevant to the story. We needed to see this twist to his character early so that it doesn't feel like they took a cool mysterious guy and made him evil, because we see both sides of him immediately, so we know that their character traits are not retcons, which it could have easily seemed like had there been several arcs in between his introduction and this reveal. He's more villain-like from this point forward, And in that sense, he's sort of less interesting, but I think the strength of his introduction affords him the ability to be a more conventional villain for the next huge chunk of the story without him becoming boring, because the setup holds the promise of a payoff. And I think Zoro and Luffy's reaction to him is worth bearing in mind when thinking of his character, because they seem just slightly wary of him. Like they sensed something was off, probably before you as a reader did. The most interesting takeaway from Jaya and its two antagonists is that it teaches us which version of antagonism is going to be viable as we move forward through the story of One Piece. Bellamy is the enemy of romance, and he's a much clearer antithesis to Luffy's and probably to Oda's sensibilities than Blackbeard is, certainly in the context of Jaya. And in ways that makes Bellamy a much more obvious candidate to be the big bad in a story like this. Usually the main antagonist would be someone who occupies the ideologically opposite ground to the protagonist. But through Blackbeard's introduction, Oda makes it a point to show how similar he and Luffy are instead. They're opposites in some aspect, sure, their taste in food for one, and also Blackbeard's a big old schemer where Luffy is driven by instinct, but they're similar in terms of drive and in terms of their goals. We don't know exactly what Blackbeard's ultimate goal is yet, but I suspect it's not far off from Luffy's ultimate goal. He definitely wants the One Piece and probably also to be the freest man on the seas. Though where Luffy would like other people to be free as well, I suspect Blackbeard probably isn't quite so considerate. Some people think Luffy has an opposite in the Marines, namely a Kainu, and an opposite pirate in Blackbeard. But if that's what we're building toward, I suspect Blackbeard's introduction would have looked a lot more like Bellamy's, which is truly in opposition to everything Luffy stands for. This distinction, the choice of Blackbeard over Bellamy, means that we can expect Bellamy's views to not be viable in the endgame of One Piece. His new age is for those without vision, without romance, and without faith. If Bellamy was a One Piece fan, he'd be in the group that's still saying that One Piece is going to be the friends we made along the way. There won't be a real treasure. Shut up, Bellamy. It's confirmed. Coming back to Bam here, the reason I haven't brought him up yet is that he feels almost completely disconnected from whatever's happening on Jaya. Credits on the island for its connection with Skypiea and Noland, and not for any reason to do with the pirate town which is there currently. And the only crossover he has with the plot of Jaya is when Bellamy steals his gold, which is a scene that's not even shown. So he's essentially there to tie Skypiea and Jaya together. It becomes obvious during Skypiea why that's necessary and even beautiful. That said, I find it the least compelling part of Jaya in isolation. But when we think about it mechanically, meaning what does it do in the story, it's actually very well executed. The only real point of comparison we have at this point in the story are the arcs leading up to Alabasta, but really Whiskey Peak is the only one that ties into Alabasta in the end. And it's only in the sense that we meet crucial characters there. The island itself, and the concept of baiting pirates to the island, having a party for them, then turning against them for the bounty, doesn't really connect with the Alabasta plot at all, even though it's the Baroque works carrying it out. What the Alabasta build-up does well is it gets us emotionally connected to Vivi, and in that sense it may be for the best that they have a couple of random adventures that don't tie into her arc while she's traveling with the crew. But Jaya does something quite different. Obviously, we can't have Noland traveling with the crew through 5 islands before Skypiea, so instead, his role seems to initially be isolated to helping the crew get to Sky Island, and only once they're there do we figure out that the story's about a golden city disappearing, which could have just been a way to ground these characters with some goals and motivations and backstory, or it could have come up again much later in the story, as Oda is wont to do. But instead we tie back to Noland halfway through Skypiea, when the crew works out that the Verth in the sky is actually half of Jaya, knocked up there by the same stream that they used. Then the connection is further deepened through the flashback, where we go from liking Cricket and wanting him to succeed in his mission to clear his ancestor's name, to, like him, wanting Noland's name to be cleared for ourselves, simply because his life was tragic and he was misinterpreted by the world. And we don't necessarily connect this consciously while reading the flashback, but by the end of Skypiea, when the bell rings and we cut to the live chestnut footage, then I think the scenes from Jaya and the flashback sort of come to a point and we end up with a real connection to the man's plight. It's less emotionally charged than Vivi's climax, so to speak, but there's some value in the feel-good character resolutions as well. And so I think as a whole, I probably underappreciated Cricket going into this. It's unfair to separate him from Skypiea and say he wasn't that interesting. Vivi wasn't that interesting either, if you only count her from Reverse Mountain to Drum Island. You may now be expecting me to tie all this into a conclusion that argues why I think it's the best build-up arc in the series, but I won't because it's clickbait. You shouldn't rank order art, you idiot.